In the shadow of towering cathedrals and crumbling castle walls, where superstition reigned supreme and scientific understanding flickered like a dying candle, medieval medicine practiced an art more terrifying than the diseases it claimed to cure. This is not a story of medical triumph, but of humanity's desperate struggle against death using methods that often hastened its arrival. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, when Europe lay shrouded in what we call the Dark Ages, physicians wielded scalpels like primitive shamans, believing that drilling holes in skulls could release demons, and that draining a patient's lifeblood could restore their health. The medieval medical practitioner was part doctor, part priest, and part executioner, often killing more patients than they saved in their misguided attempts at healing. Welcome to an era where the cure was frequently deadlier than the disease, where medical knowledge was built upon ancient superstitions rather than scientific observation, and where a visit to the doctor might very well be your last. This is the horrifying truth behind medieval medicine, a tale of bloodletting, skull drilling, and treatments so barbaric they would make modern torture seem merciful. In the coming exploration, we will venture into the darkest corners of medieval medical practice, examining the 3 pillars of their healing arts. The ancient practice of bloodletting that drained life instead of restoring it, the savage art of trepanation that turned human skulls into scythes, and the vast catalog of superstitious treatments that killed more through ignorance than malice. These were not the practices of madmen, but the accepted medical wisdom of an entire civilization, a civilization that placed faith above reason and tradition above truth. To understand the horrifying practices of medieval medicine, we must first examine the twisted foundation upon which these treatments were built. Medieval physicians didn't simply wake up one morning and decide to torture their patients. Their methods were rooted in ancient theories that had become gospel truth, passed down through generations without question or scientific scrutiny. The cornerstone of medieval medical understanding was the theory of the 4 bodily humors, inherited from the ancient Greek physician Galen. This theory held that humans carried 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and these had to be kept in balance to maintain health. When illness struck, medieval doctors believed it was caused by an imbalance of these mysterious fluids coursing through the body. Blood was associated with air and considered hot and moist. It was believed to be produced in the liver and was thought to give people their vitality and courage. Phlegm, linked to water, was cold and moist, supposedly originating in the brain and lungs. Yellow bile, connected to fire, was hot and dry, believed to come from the gallbladder and liver. Finally, black bile, associated with earth, was cold and dry, thought to be produced by the spleen and responsible for melancholy. This wasn't merely abstract theory, it dictated every aspect of medical treatment. If a patient appeared too sanguine or blood-dominant, they would be subjected to bloodletting to reduce their blood humor. If they seemed phlegmatic, treatments would focus on drying out their excessive moisture. The entire medieval medical system was built upon this house of cards, with each treatment designed to restore what physicians believed was the natural balance of these 4 fluids. But the humoral theory was just one pillar of medieval medical ignorance. Astrology played an equally important role in diagnosis and treatment. Medieval physicians consulted star charts before making medical decisions, believing that the position of planets and constellations directly influenced human health. During medieval times, bleeding charts were common, showing specific bleeding sites on the body in alignment with the planets and zodiacs. The Church's influence on medical practice cannot be understated. In an age when religious doctrine superseded scientific inquiry, many illnesses were attributed to divine punishment for sin or demonic possession. This theological approach to medicine meant that treatments often involved prayer, exorcism, and ritual purification alongside, or instead of, any physical intervention. Medieval medical education, such as it was, consisted primarily of memorizing ancient texts rather than observing actual patients or conducting experiments. Students spent years learning to recite Galen's writings by heart, never questioning whether these centuries-old theories bore any resemblance to reality. This created a medical establishment that was remarkably resistant to new ideas or evidence that contradicted established doctrine. The result was a medical system that was not merely ineffective, but actively harmful. Treatments were prescribed based on theoretical frameworks that had no basis in biological reality, administered by practitioners who had never been trained to question their methods or observe their results. It was into this world of medical superstition and theoretical madness that the most horrifying practices of medieval medicine were born. Of all the barbaric practices that defined medieval medicine, none was more prevalent, more accepted, or more deadly than bloodletting. This was not a fringe treatment performed by quacks and charlatans. It was the cornerstone of respectable medical practice, prescribed by the most learned physicians for virtually every ailment known to mankind. Medieval doctors prescribed blood draining as a treatment for everything from a sore throat to the plague, believing with unwavering certainty that removing blood from the body could cure diseases that we now know require completely different treatments. The logic, such as it was, stemmed from the humoral theory. If illness was caused by an excess of blood humor, then the obvious solution was to drain away the surplus. The practice of bloodletting was so ingrained in medieval culture that barber-surgeons practiced it. These individuals were men who could trim a person's hair or beard, as well as pulling out badly damaged teeth and withdrawing blood. Imagine visiting your local barber not just for a haircut, but for a medical procedure that could cost you your life. The red and white striped barber pole that still adorns barbershops today is actually a grim reminder of this bloody history. The red representing blood, the white representing bandages. But bloodletting wasn't performed haphazardly. Medieval physicians had developed elaborate systems to determine when, where, and how much blood should be removed. They created detailed charts showing the optimal bleeding points on the human body, correlated with astrological signs and planetary movements. A patient's age, constitution, the season, the phase of the moon, and their zodiac sign all influenced the physician's decision about bloodletting procedures. The tools of bloodletting were as varied as they were horrifying. The doctor would open a vein with a lancet or sharpened piece of wood, causing blood to flow out and into a waiting receptacle. If you got lucky, leeches might perform the gruesome task in place of crude instruments. The lancet, a sharp, double-edged knife specifically designed for making incisions in veins, was the physician's primary weapon. These instruments were often reused without sterilization, passing infection from patient to patient. For those wealthy enough to afford it, specially trained leeches offered a supposedly more refined approach to bloodletting. These blood-sucking parasites were applied to specific points on the body where they would gorge themselves on the patient's blood. Physicians maintained detailed knowledge about different types of leeches, their preferences for certain body parts, and how much blood each species would typically consume. The amount of blood removed during a typical bloodletting session would shock modern medical sensibilities. Some practitioners were known to remove extraordinary amounts of blood and often bled patients several times. Patients might lose a pint or more of blood in a single session, and these sessions might be repeated daily for weeks. For someone already weakened by illness, this massive blood loss often proved fatal. What makes bloodletting particularly tragic is that medieval physicians genuinely believed they were helping their patients. They observed that some patients seemed to improve after bloodletting, not realizing that any improvement was either coincidental or represented the body's natural healing process. They never conducted controlled studies to compare bloodletting with no treatment, never questioned why so many of their patients died, never considered that their cure might be worse than the disease. The practice was so embedded in medical culture that questioning bloodletting was considered heretical. Physicians who suggested that removing large quantities of blood might weaken patients were ridiculed by their colleagues and ostracized from the medical community. This created a self-reinforcing system where dangerous practices continued unchallenged for centuries. The actual process of medieval bloodletting was a ritualized horror that combined medical ignorance with surgical brutality. To understand the true barbarity of this practice, we must examine not just the theory behind it, but the grim reality of how it was performed on countless victims across medieval Europe. The procedure typically began with an elaborate consultation where the physician would examine the patient's complexion, feel their pulse, inspect their urine, and consult astrological charts to determine the optimal approach. The patient's humoral constitution would be assessed. Were they choleric, melancholic, sanguine, or phlegmatic? Each type required different bloodletting techniques, different amounts of blood removal, and different locations for making the incisions. The earliest bloodletting practices used sharp thorns or animal teeth, but this evolved into lancets that allowed easier access to veins. By the medieval period, physicians possessed an arsenal of specialized instruments designed specifically for opening human veins. The fleam, a thumb lancet with multiple differently sized blades, was the most common tool. Each blade was designed for specific types of incisions: smaller blades for delicate work on children or the elderly, larger blades for robust adults who could presumably withstand more trauma. The selection of the bleeding site was considered crucial to the success of the treatment. Medieval physicians had identified numerous points on the human body where veins could be accessed for bloodletting. The most common site was the median cubital vein at the elbow, but blood was also drawn from veins in the forehead, neck, hands, feet, and even more intimate locations. Some physicians specialized in temporal bleeding, making incisions near the temples that were particularly dangerous due to their proximity to major blood vessels and the brain. The actual cutting was performed with ritual precision. The physician would tie a tourniquet around the limb to make the veins more prominent, then make a swift incision with the lancet. Blood would pour from the wound into a specially designed bowl called a bleeding bowl or porringer. These vessels were often marked with measurement lines to help the physician gauge how much blood had been removed. The amount of blood extracted varied wildly depending on the physician's judgment and the patient's supposed condition. A typical bloodletting session might remove anywhere from a few ounces to more than a quart of blood. Some aggressive practitioners advocated bleeding patients to syncope, literally until they lost consciousness from blood loss. This was considered a sign that the excess humors had been successfully purged. Many diseases were thought to be caused by an excess of blood in the body, and bloodletting was seen as the obvious cure. Fevers, headaches, inflammation, mental illness, and even broken bones were all treated with bloodletting. Pregnant women were bled to prevent complications during childbirth. Children were bled for behavioral problems. The elderly were bled to maintain their health. No condition seemed to exist that couldn't be treated by draining the patient's blood. The aftermath of bloodletting was often worse than the original illness. Patients weakened by massive blood loss were prone to infection, fainting, and shock. The unsterilized instruments used for the procedure frequently introduced new infections into the bloodstream. Many patients who survived the initial bloodletting succumbed to complications days or weeks later. Yet perhaps most horrifying of all was the repeated nature of bloodletting treatments. A single session was rarely considered sufficient. Patients might be bled daily for weeks or months. Medieval medical texts describe cases where patients underwent dozens of bloodletting sessions for chronic conditions, each session further weakening their already compromised systems. The practice created a grotesque cycle of medical abuse. As patients grew weaker from repeated blood loss, physicians interpreted their deteriorating condition as evidence that more bloodletting was needed. The cure became a progressive poisoning that could only end in recovery if the patient was fortunate enough to survive, or death. The widespread practice of bloodletting in medieval Europe wasn't just a medical phenomenon. It was a thriving economic enterprise that created entire industries built around the extraction of human blood. Understanding the financial incentives behind bloodletting reveals how economic interests helped perpetuate this deadly practice for centuries. Some barbers listed bloodletting as a service along with haircuts and shaves. This commercialization of bloodletting meant that the procedure was available on virtually every street corner, performed by individuals with minimal medical training who were motivated more by profit than patient welfare. The democratization of bloodletting made it accessible to all social classes, but it also meant that untrained practitioners were performing dangerous medical procedures for a few coins. The barber-surgeon represented the lower tier of medieval medical practice, but even trained physicians found bloodletting to be highly profitable. Unlike complex surgical procedures that required extensive preparation and carried significant liability risks, bloodletting was quick, simple, and could be performed multiple times on the same patient. A physician could see dozens of patients per day for bloodletting procedures, generating substantial income with minimal effort. The tools of bloodletting became valuable commodities in their own right. Skilled craftsmen specialized in creating lancets, fleams, and bleeding bowls. These instruments were often works of art, with elaborate decorative handles and finely crafted blades. Wealthy patients would commission personalized bloodletting instruments, turning the tools of their medical torture into status symbols. Perhaps most disturbing was the trade in medicinal leeches, which became a significant commercial enterprise. Leech collectors, known as leech gatherers, would wade into swamps and ponds to harvest these blood-sucking parasites. The creatures were then sorted by size and species, with certain types commanding premium prices for specific medical applications. Large, robust leeches that could consume substantial amounts of blood were particularly valuable. The leech trade created its own specialized knowledge base. Merchants needed to understand the preferences of different leech species, how to keep them alive during transport, and which types were best suited for various medical procedures. Some enterprising individuals established leech farms, creating artificial breeding environments to ensure a steady supply of these medical parasites. The economic incentives surrounding bloodletting also influenced medical education and practice standards. Since bloodletting was so profitable, medical schools emphasized training in these procedures over more complex diagnostic skills. Students learned dozens of different bloodletting techniques, but might graduate without ever learning to properly examine a patient or consider alternative treatments. This commercial aspect of bloodletting created powerful resistance to medical reform. When evidence began to emerge that bloodletting might be harmful, physicians had strong financial incentives to ignore or suppress such findings. Admitting that bloodletting was ineffective would have destroyed the livelihood of thousands of medical practitioners and related tradespeople. The church also found ways to profit from bloodletting, incorporating the practice into religious healing rituals. Monastic communities often included trained bloodletters among their members, offering these services to pilgrims and local communities. The combination of spiritual healing and medical bloodletting proved particularly lucrative, as patients believed they were receiving both divine intervention and medical treatment. Towns and cities regulated bloodletting practices, but primarily to ensure tax collection rather than patient safety. Bloodletting practitioners were required to obtain licenses and pay fees to local authorities. These regulations created official recognition of bloodletting as a legitimate medical practice, further entrenching its acceptance in medieval society. The economic ecosystem surrounding bloodletting was so extensive that it became virtually impossible to eliminate. Too many people's livelihoods depended on the continuation of the practice. Even when more effective treatments became available, the financial interests of the bloodletting industry ensured that the practice would continue for centuries beyond any reasonable medical justification. The true horror of medieval bloodletting lies not in its theoretical basis or economic exploitation, but in its devastating human cost. The practice killed countless thousands across Europe, creating a medical holocaust that was perpetrated in the name of healing. The victims of bloodletting were not just the obviously sick, but healthy individuals whose only crime was seeking medical care from the respected physicians of their time. The physiological impact of repeated bloodletting was catastrophic. The human body contains approximately 5 liters of blood, and the loss of even 1 liter can cause serious medical complications. Medieval bloodletting sessions routinely removed 500 milliliters or more, often repeatedly over short periods. Patients who underwent extensive bloodletting treatment suffered from severe anemia, weakness, compromised immune function, and ultimately organ failure. The immediate effects of bloodletting were readily apparent to anyone who cared to observe them. Patients became pale, weak, and lethargic. Their ability to fight off infections was compromised. They experienced dizziness, fainting spells, and rapid heart rates as their cardiovascular systems struggled to cope with the sudden reduction in blood volume. Yet medieval physicians interpreted these symptoms not as evidence of harm, but as proof that the treatment was working to purge excess humors from the body. Children were particularly vulnerable to bloodletting's deadly effects. Their smaller body size meant that even modest blood loss represented a significant percentage of their total blood volume. Medical texts from the period describe the bloodletting of infants and young children for various ailments, procedures that would have been fatal in many cases. The casual mention of these pediatric bloodletting cases in medieval medical literature suggests that the death of children during treatment was common enough to be unremarkable. Pregnant women represented another tragic victim category. Medieval physicians believed that bloodletting could prevent complications during pregnancy and childbirth. They would routinely bleed pregnant women throughout their pregnancies, often continuing the practice right up until delivery. The resulting anemia and weakness made childbirth far more dangerous for both mother and child, contributing to the notoriously high maternal and infant mortality rates of the medieval period. The cumulative effects of repeated bloodletting created a spiral of medical destruction. Patients who survived their initial bloodletting sessions would return to physicians with new complaints: fatigue, weakness, susceptibility to illness, all direct consequences of their previous treatments. Medieval doctors, lacking any understanding of anemia or blood physiology, would prescribe more bloodletting to address these new symptoms, further weakening their patients in an endless cycle of iatrogenic harm. Perhaps most tragically, bloodletting was often performed on patients who were already critically ill. Individuals suffering from serious infections, injuries, or chronic diseases would have their conditions exacerbated by the additional stress of blood loss. Patients who might have recovered with rest and proper nutrition were instead bled to death by well-meaning physicians who believed they were providing the best possible care. The practice also created secondary health risks through unsanitary procedures. Bloodletting instruments were rarely cleaned between patients, spreading infections from person to person. The wounds created by bloodletting could become infected, leading to sepsis and death. Some patients survived the bloodletting procedure, only to die days later from complications related to the treatment itself. Medieval medical records, such as they exist, provide glimpses into the massive scale of bloodletting-related deaths. Hospital registers from monasteries and major cities show alarming mortality rates among patients who underwent bloodletting treatments. While medieval physicians attributed these deaths to the patient's underlying conditions, modern analysis suggests that many deaths were directly caused by the bloodletting procedures themselves. The social impact of these medical deaths cannot be understated. Families were devastated by the loss of loved ones who had sought medical help. Communities lost productive members to medical treatments that were supposed to restore health. The economic cost of bloodletting-related deaths represented a massive drain on medieval society's human resources.